Chapter 9. Barrels Out of Bound. The day after the battle with the spiders, Bilbo and the dwarves made one last despairing effort to find a way out before they died of hunger and thirst. They got up and staggered on in the direction which 8 out of 13 guessed to be the one which the path lay, but they never found out if they were right. Such day as there ever was in the forest was fading once more into the blackness of night, when suddenly out sprang in the light of many torches all round them, like hundreds of red stars. Out leaped wood elves with their bows and spears, and called the dwarves to a halt. There was no thought of a fight. Even if the dwarves had not been in such a state, they were actually glad to be captured. Their small knives, their only weapons to be had, would have been no use against the arrows of the elves that could hit a bird's eye in the dark. So they simply stopped dead and sat down and waited, all except Bilbo, who popped on his ring and slipped quickly to one side. That is why, when the elves bound the dwarves in a long line, one behind the other, and counted them, they never found or counted the Hobbit. Nor did they hear or feel him trotting along well behind their torchlight as they led off their prisoners into the forest. Each dwarf was blindfolded, but that did not make much difference, for even Bilbo, with use of his eyes, could not see where they were going, and neither he nor the others knew where they had started from anyway. Bilbo had all he could do to just keep up with the torches, for elves were making the dwarves go fast as they ever could, sick and weary as they were. The king had ordered them to make haste. Suddenly the torches stopped, and the Hobbit had just the time to catch up to them before they began to cross the bridge. This was the bridge that led across the river to the king's doors. The water flowed dark and swift and strong beneath, and at the far end were gates before the mouth of a huge cave that ran deep into the side of a steep slope covered with trees. There were great beaches that came right up to the bank, till their feet were in the stream. Along the bridge the elves thrust their prisoners, but Bilbo hesitated in the rear. He did not at all like the look of the cavern mouth, and only made up his mind not to desert his friends just in time to scuttle over the heels of the last elves before the great gates of the king closed behind them with a clang. Inside, the passages were lit with red torchlight, and the elf guards sang as they marched along the twisting, crossing, echoing paths. These were not like of the goblin cities. They were smaller, less deep underground, and filled with a cleaner air. In a great hall with pillars hewn out of the living stone sat the elven king on a chair of carven wood. On his head was a crown of berries and red leaves, for autumn was come again. In the spring he wore a crown of woodland flowers. In his hand he held a carven staff of oak. The prisoners were brought before him, and though he looked grimly at them, he told his men to unbind them, for they were ragged and weary. "Besides, they need no ropes in here," said he. "There is no escape from my magic doors for those who were once brought inside." Long and searchingly he questioned the dwarves about their doings, and where they were going to, and where they were coming from, but he got little more news out of them than out of Thorin. They were surly and angry and did not even pretend to be polite. "Oh, what have we done, O king?" said Balin, who was the eldest left. "Is it a crime to be lost in a forest, to be hungry and thirsty, to be trapped by spiders? Are the spiders your tame beasts or your pets, if killing them makes you angry?" Such a question, of course, made the king angrier than ever, and he answered, "Is it a crime to wander in my realm without leave? It is a crime. Do you forget that you are in my kingdom, using the roads my people made? Did you not 3 times pursue and trouble my people in the forests, and rouse the spiders with your rioted clamor? After all the disturbance you made, I have a right to know what brings you here, and if you will not tell me now, I will keep you all in prison until you've learned sense and manners." Then he ordered the dwarves to each be put in separate cell, and to be given food and drink, but not to be allowed to pass the doors of their little prisons, at least not until one of them was willing to tell him all he wanted to know. But he did not tell them that Thorin was also a prisoner with them. It was Bilbo who found that out. Poor Mr. Baggins! It was a weary long time that he lived in that place all alone, always in hiding, never daring to take off his ring, hardly daring to sleep, even tucked away in the darkest and remote corners that he could find. For something to do, he took to wandering about the Elven King's palace. Magic shut the gates, but he could sometimes get out if he was quick. Companies of the Wood Elves, sometimes with the king out at their head, would from time to time ride out to hunt, or to other business in the woods and the lands in the east. Then, if Bilbo was very nimble, he could slip out just behind them, though it was a dangerous thing to do. More than once he nearly caught in the doors as they crashed together with the last elf past, yet he did not dare to march among them because of his shadow, although thin and wobbly it was in torchlight, or for fear of being bumped into and discovered. And when he did go out, which was not very often, he did no good. He did not wish to desert the dwarves, and indeed he did not know where the world would go without them. He could not keep up with the hunting elves all the time when they were out, so he discovered the ways out of the wood, and was left to wander miserably in the forest, terrified of losing himself, until a chance came of returning. He was hungry too outside, for he was no hunter. But inside the caves he could pick up a living of some sort by stealing food from the store or table when no one was at hand. I'm like a burglar who can't get away, but must go on miserably burgling the same house day after day, he thought. This is the dreariest and dullest part of all of this wretched, tiresome, comfortable adventure. I wish I was back in my hobbit hole with my own warm fireside with the lamp shining. He often wished, too, that if he could get a message for help sent to the wizard, but that, of course, was quite impossible, and he soon realized if anything was to be done, it would have to be done by Mr. Baggins, alone and unaided. Eventually, after a week or two of this sneaking sort of life, by watching and following the guards and taking what chances he could, he managed to find out where each dwarf was kept. He found all their 12 little selves in different parts of the palace, and after a time he got to know his way about very well. What was his surprise one day to overhear some of the guards talking to learn that there was another dwarf in prison too, in a specially dark, deep place. He guessed, of course, at once that this was Thorin, and after a while he found that his guess was right. At last, after many difficulties, he managed to find the place when no one was about, and to have a word with the chief of the dwarves. Thorin was too wretched to be angry any longer at his misfortunes, and was even beginning to think the king all about the treasure in his quest, which shows how low his spirits had become. When he heard Bilbo's little voice at his keyhole, he could hardly believe his ears. Soon, however, he made up his mind that he could not be mistaken, and he came out to the door and had a long whispered talk with the hobbit on the other side. So it was that Bilbo was able to secretly take Thorin's message to each of the other imprisoned dwarves, telling them that Thorin, their chief, was also in prison close at hand, and though no one was to reveal their errand to the king, not yet, not before Thorin gave the word. For Thorin had taken heart to hearing how the hobbit had rescued his companions from the spiders, and was determined once more not to ransom himself with promises to the king a share in the treasure, until all hope of escaping had otherwise disappeared. Until, in fact, the remarkable Mr. Invisible Baggins, of which he began to have quite a high opinion of indeed, had altogether failed to think of something clever. The other dwarves quite agreed when they got the message. They all thought their own shares in the treasure which they regarded as theirs, in spite of their plight and still unconquered dragon, would suffer seriously if the wood elves claimed part of it. They all trusted Bilbo. Just what Gandalf had said would happen, you see. Perhaps this was part of his reason for going off and leaving them. Bilbo, however, did not feel nearly so hopeful as they did. He did not like being depended on by everyone, and he wished he had the wizard back at hand. But that was no use. Probably all the dark distance of Mirkwood lay behind them. He sat and thought until his head nearly burst. His bright idea would not come. One invisible ring was a very fine thing, but it was not much good among 14. But of course, as you have guessed, he did rescue his friends in the end. And this is how it happened. One day, nosing and wandering about, Bilbo discovered a very interesting thing. The great gates were not the only entrance to the caves. A stream flowed underneath parts of the lowest regions of the palace, and joined the forest river some further away to the east, beyond a steep slope of which the main mouth opened. Where this underground watercourse came forth from, the hillside, there was a water gate. There was a rocky roof come close to the surface of the stream, and from it a portcullis could be dropped right in the bed of the river to prevent anyone from coming in or out that way. But the portcullis was always open, for a good deal of the traffic went in and out by the water gate. If anyone had come through in that way, he would have found himself in a dark tunnel leading to the heart of the hill. But at one point where it passed under the caves of the roof that had been cut away and covered with great oaken trapdoors. These opened upwards into the king's cellars. There stood barrels and barrels and barrels, for wood elves, and especially their king, were very fond of wine. No vines grew in these parts. The wine and other goods were brought from far away, from their kinfolk in the south, or from the vineyards of men in distant lands. Hiding behind one of the largest barrels, Bilbo discovered the trapdoor in their use, and lurking there, listening to the talk of the king's servants, he learned how the wine and other goods came from the river, or overland to Long Lake. It seemed a town of men still throve there, built on bridges far out into the water as protection against enemies of all sorts, and especially the dragon of the mountain. From Lake Town, the barrels were brought up the forest river. Often they were just tied together like big rafts and pulled or rowed up the stream, and sometimes they were loaded on flat boats. When the barrels were empty, the elves cast them through the trapdoors, opened the water gate, and out the barrels floated on the stream, bobbing along until they carried out by the current to a place far down the river where the bank shut it out, near to the very eastern edge of Mirkwood. There they would be collected and tied together and floated back to Lake Town, which stood close to the point where the forest river flowed into the Long Lake. For some time Bilbo sat and thought about this water gate, and wondered if it could be used as an escape for his friends, and at last he had the desperate beginnings of a plan. The evening meal had just been taken to the prisoners. The guards were tramping away in the passages, taking the torchlight with them, and leaving everything in the darkness. Then Bilbo heard the king's butler bidding the chief guards good night. "Now, come with me," he said, "and taste the new wine that just came in. I should be hard at work tonight clearing the cellars of empty wood, so let's have a drink first to help with the labor." "Very good," laughed the chief of the guards. "I'll taste with you and see if it's fit to the king's table. There's a feast night, and you don't want to send up the poor stuff." When he heard this, Bilbo was all in a flutter, for he saw that luck was with him, and he had a chance at once to try his desperate plan. He followed the two elves until they entered a small cellar, and sat down at a table where 2 large flagons were set. Soon they began to drink and laugh merrily. Luck of an unusual kind was with Bilbo then. It must be some potent wine to make wood elf drowsy, but this wine, it was seen, was the heady vintage of some great gardens of Dorwyn, not meant for soldiers or servants, but for the king's feasts only, and smaller bowls were not for the butler's great flagons. Very soon the chief guard nodded his head, and they laid it on the table and fell fast asleep. The butler went on talking and laughing to himself for a while, without seeming to notice, but soon his head too nodded onto the table, and he fell asleep and snored beside his friend. Then in crept the Hobbit. Very soon the chief guard had no keys, but Bilbo was trotting on as fast as he could to the passageway towards the cells. It was a great bunch seemed very heavy. The great bunch seemed very heavy to his arms, and his heart was often in his mouth, in spite of his ring, for he could not prevent the keys from making every now and then a large clink and clang, which put him on all a tremble. First he unlocked Balin's door, and locked it again carefully as soon as the dwarf was outside. Balin was most surprised, as you can imagine, but glad to get out of his wearisome little stone room, and wanted to stop and ask questions, and know what Bilbo was going to do, and all about it. "No time now," said the Hobbit. "You just have to follow me. We all must keep together and not risk getting us separated. All of us must escape, or none, and this is our last chance. If this is found out, goodness knows where the king will put you next, with chains on your hands and feet too, I expect. Don't argue, there's a good fellow." And then off he went from door to door, until his following had grown to 12, none of them any too nimble, what with the dark and their long imprisonment. Bilbo's heart thumped every one of them bumped into another, or grunted or whispered in the dark. "Drat this dwarven racket," he said to himself. But all went well, and they met no guards. As a matter of fact, there was a great autumn feast in the woods that night and in the halls above. Nearly all the king's folk were merrymaking. At last, after much blundering, they came up to Thorin's dungeon, far down in a deep place, and fortunately not far from the cellars. "Upon my word," said Thorin, when Bilbo whispered to him to come out and join his friends, "Gandalf spoke truth as usual. A pretty fine burglar you make, it seems, when the time comes. I'm sure we all are forever at your service, whatever happens after this. But what comes next?" Bilbo saw that the time had come to explain his idea, as far as he could, but he could not feel how all sure the dwarves would take it. His fears were quite justified, for they did not like it a bit, and started grumbling loudly in spite of their danger. "We shall be bruised and battered to pieces, and drowned too, for certain," they muttered. "We thought you had some sensible notion when you managed to get hold of the keys. This is a mad idea." "Very well," called Bilbo, very downcast, and rather annoyed. "Come back to your nice selves. I will lock you all back in place, and there you can sit comfortably and think of a better plan. But I don't suppose I should ever get hold of the keys again, even if I feel inclined to try." That was too much for them, and they calmed down. In the end, of course, they had to do just what Bilbo had suggested. It was obviously impossible for them to try and find their way out in the upper halls, or to fight their way out of gates that were closed by magic. It was no good grumbling in the passages until they were caught again. So the Hobbit, down into the lowest cellars they crept. They passed a door through which the chief guard and butler could still be seen, happily snoring with their smiles upon their faces. The mind of Dorwinian brings deep and pleasant dreams. There would be a different expression on the face of the chief guard the next day, even though Bilbo, before he went on, stole in and kind-heartedly put the keys back on his belt. "That will save some son of the trouble he's in for," said Mr. Baggins to himself. "He wasn't a bad fellow, and quite decent to the prisoners. It will puzzle them all, too. They'll think we have very strong magic to pass through all these locked doors and disappear. Disappear! We'd best get busy very quick if that is to happen." Balin was told off to watch the guard and the butler and give warning if they stirred. The rest went to the adjoining cellar with trapdoors. They had little time to lose. Before long, as Bilbo knew, some elves were under orders to come down and help the butler get the empty barrels through the doors and into the stream. These were, in fact, already standing in rows in the middle of the floor, waiting to be pushed off. Some of them were wine barrels, and these were not much use, as they could not be easily opened at end with a great deal of noise, nor could they easily be secured again. But among them were several others, and they were to be used for bringing other stuffs, butter, apples, all sorts of things to the king's palace. They soon found that 13 with room enough for a dwarf in each. In fact, some were too roomy, and they climbed in. The dwarves thought anxiously of shaking and bumping that would get inside, though Bilbo did his best to find some straw and other stuff to pack them in as cozily as they managed to in a short time. At last 12 dwarves were stowed. Thorin had a lot of trouble, and turned and twisted in his tub, and grumbled like a large dog in a small kennel. While Balin, who came last, made a great fuss about his air holes, and said he was stifling, even before his lid was on. Bilbo had done what he could to close holes in the sides of the barrels, and to fix on all the lids as safely as he could have managed. And now again he was left alone, running round putting the finishing touches on his packing, and hoping against hope that his plan would come off. It had not been a bit too soon. Only a minute or two after Balin's lid had been fitted on, there came a sound of voices and a flicker of lights. A number of elves came laughing and talking through the cellars, and singing snatches of songs. They had left a merry feast in one of the halls, and were bent on returning as soon as they could. "Where's old Gallion the butler?" said one. "I haven't seen him up at the tables tonight. He'll have to be here now and show us what is to be done." "I should be angry if the old show coach is late," said another. "I have no wish to wait town time here when song is up." "Ha ha!" came a cry. "Here's the old villain with his head on a jug. He's been having a little feast to himself and his friend the captain." "Shake him, wake him," shouted the others impatiently. Gallion was not at all pleased to be shaken or wakened, and a little bit laughed at. "You're all late," he grumbled. "Here I am waiting and waiting down here, while you fellows drink and make merry and forget your tasks. Small wonder I fell asleep from weariness." "Some wonder," they said, "when the explanation stands close at hand in a jug. Come, give us a taste of your sleeping draught before we fall to. No need to wake the turkey yonder. He has had his fair share by the looks of it." Then they drank once round, and began mighty merry all of a sudden, but they did not quite lose their wits. "Save us, Gallion," cried some. "You began your feasting early and muddied your wits. You've stacked some full casks here instead of the empty ones. If there's anything at weight." "Get on with your work," growled the butler. "There is nothing but the filling the weights in an idle tosspot's arms. These ones are good and to go, and no others. Do as I say." Very well," they answered, rolling the barrels to the opening. "On your head be it, if the king's full butter tubs and his best wine is pushed into the river for the lakemen to feast on for nothing. Roll, 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 rolling down the hole, heave ho, splash plump, down they go, down they bump." So they sang it first as one barrel, then another rumbled to the dark opening, was pushed over into the cold water some feet below. Some were barrels really empty, and some were tubs neatly packed with a dwarf each, but down all they went, one after another, with many of a clash and a bump, and thudding on top of one another, and smacking into the water, jostling against the walls of the tunnel, knocking into one another, and bobbling all the way down to the current. It was thus at this moment that Bilbo suddenly discovered a weak point in his plan. "Most likely you saw it some time ago and have been laughing at him. But I don't suppose you would have not done half as well if with yourself in his place. Of course, he was not in a barrel himself, nor was there anyone to pack him in, even if he had a chance. It looked as if he would certainly lose his friends this time. Nearly all of them had already disappeared through the dark trap-door, and he urgently got utterly left behind and had to stay lurking as a permanent burglar in the elf caves forever. Or even if he had escaped through the upper gates at once, he had a precious small chance of ever finding the dwarves again. He did not know the way by land to the place where the barrels were collected. He wondered what on earth would happen to them without him, for he had not time to tell the dwarves all that he had learned, or what he had meant to do once they were out of the woods. While all these thoughts were passing through his mind, the elves began to sing a song round the river door. Some had already gone to haul the were on the ropes which pulled up the portcullis at water gate, as to let up the barrels as soon as they were afloat below. Down the swift river dark stream you go, back to lands you once did know. Leave the halls and caverns deep, leave the northern mountains steep, where the forest wide and dim stoops and grey and grim. Float beyond the world of trees, out into the whispering breeze, past the rushes, past the reeds, past the marshes' waving weeds, through the mist that rises white, up from mare and pool at night. Follow stars that leap up the heavens cold and steep. Turn when dawn comes over land, over rapid, over sand. South away, seek the sunlight and the day. Back to pasture, back to mead, where the kine and oxes feed. Back to gardens on the hills, and berry swells and fills, under sunlight, under day, south away and south away. Down the swift dark stream you go, back to lands you once did know. Now the very last barrel was being rolled to the doors. In despair and not knowing what else to do, poor little Bilbo caught hold of it and was pushed over the edge with it. Down into the water he fell, splash into the cold water with the barrel on top of him. He came up sputtering and clinging to the wood like a rat, but for all his efforts he could not scramble up on top. Every time he tried, the barrel rolled and ducked under him again. It was really empty. It floated like a cork. Though his ears were full of water, he could hear the elves still singing in the cellar above. Then suddenly the trapdoor fell to with a boom, and their voices faded away. He was in the dark tunnel, floating in icy water, all alone, for you cannot find friends that are all packed up in barrels. Very soon a grey patch came in the darkness ahead. He heard the creak of the water gate being hauled up, and he found that he was in the midst of bobbing and bumping in masses of casks and tubs, all pressing together to pass under the arch and get out into the open stream. He had much to do as he could to prevent himself from being hustled and battered to bits, but at last the jostling crowd began to break up and swing off, one by one under the stony arch and away. Then he saw he would have to be no good if he had even managed to get astride his barrel, for there was no room to spare, not even the Hobbit, between its top and the suddenly stooping roof where the gate was. Out they went under the overhanging branches of trees on either bank. Bilbo wondered what the dwarves were feeling, and whether a lot of water had gotten into their tubs. Some of them, those that bobbed along the way in the gloom, seemed pretty low in the water, and he guessed these had the dwarves inside. I do hope I put on the lids tight enough, he thought, but before long he was worrying too much about himself to remember the dwarves. He managed to keep his head above water, but he was shivering with cold, and he was wondering if he would die before his luck turned, and how much longer he would be able to hang on, and whether he should risk the chance of letting go and trying to swim to the bank. The luck turned all right before long, and the eddying current carried several barrels close ashore at one point, and there for a while they stuck against some hidden root. Then Bilbo took the opportunity of scrambling up the side of the barrel while his head steadying its nether. Up he crowned like a drowned rat, and lay on top spread to keep out the balance as best he could. The breeze was cold, but better than water, and he hoped that he would not suddenly roll off again when they started to move once more. Before long the barrels broke free and turned and twisted down the stream, and out into the main current. There he found it quite difficult to stick on as he had feared, but he managed it somehow, though miserably uncomfortable. Luckily, it was very light, and the barrel was a good bigger one, and being rather leaky, it now shipped a small amount of the water. All the same, it was like trying to ride without bridle or stirrups, a round-bellied pony always thinking of rolling on the grass. In this way, at last, Mr. Baggins came to a place where the trees on either hand grew thinner. He could see the paler sky between them. The dark river opened suddenly wide, and there it was joined with the main water of the forest river, flowing down in haste from the king's great door. There was a dim sheet of water, no longer overshadowed. On its shining surface there was dancing the broken reflection of clouds and of stars. Then the hurrying water of the forest river swept all the company of casks and tubs away to the north bank, from which it was eaten out by a wide bay. There, this had a shingly shore, under hanging banks that walled up the eastern end by a little jutting cape of hard rock. On the shallow shore, most of the barrels ran aground, though a few went on to bump against the stony pier. There were people on lookout on the banks. They quickly poled up and pushed out the barrels into the shadows, and there they counted them and roped them together and left them till morning. Poor dwarves! Bilbo was not badly off now. He had slipped from his barrels and waded ashore, and then sneaked along to some huts where he could see the water's edge. He no longer thought twice about picking up a supper uninvited when he got the chance. He had been obliged to do it for so long. And he knew now only too well when he was really hungry, not merely politely interested in the dainties of a well-filled larder. Also, he had caught a glimpse of the fire through the trees. That appealed to him, with his dripping and ragged clothes clinging to him dark, cold, and clammy. There is no need to tell you much of his adventure that night, for now we are very drawing near to the end of the eastward journey, and coming to the last and greatest adventurer. So we must hurry on. Of course, helped by his magic ring, he got on very well at first, but he was given away in the end by his wet footsteps and a trail of drippings wherever he went or sat, and also he began to snivel. Whenever he tried to hide, he found out by the terrific explosions of his surprised sneezes. Very soon, there was a very fine commotion in the village by the riverside, but Bilbo escaped in the woods carrying a loaf and a leather bottle of wine and a pie that did not belong to him. The rest of the night he had to pass wet as he was, and far from a fire, but the bottle helped him even do that, and he actually dozed a little on some dry leaves, even though the year was getting late and the air was chilly. He woke again with a specially loud sneeze. It was already grey morning, and it was a merry racket down by the river. They were making up the raft of barrels, and the raft elves would soon be steering it off down the river to Lake Down. Bilbo sneezed again. He was no longer dripping, but he felt cold all over. He scrambled down as fast as his stiff legs would take him, and he managed to get just in time to get on the mass of casks without being noticed in the general bustle. Luckily, there was no sun at the time to cast an awkward shadow, for Mercy did not sneeze for a good while either. There was a great mighty pushing of poles. The elves were standing in the shallow water, heaved and shoved. The barrels were all lashed together, creaked and fretted. "This is a heavy load," some grumbled. "They float too deep. Some of them are never empty. If they had come to shore in the daylight, we might have had a look inside," they said. "No time now," cried the raftman. "Shove off." And off they went at last, slowly at first, until they passed the point of rock where the other elves stood to fend them off with poles, and then quicker and quicker as they caught up on the main stream, and went sailing down the way, down towards the lake. They had escaped the dungeons of the king and through the woods, but whether dead or alive still remains to be seen.